Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here looking at the subject of art and science regeneration, because that is central to what we do at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where for 4 months now I've been the director, which was a joy before the calling of the general election, has been a particular joy during the general election, that lovely moment when you wake up and you don't have to knock on a stranger's door at 10 a.m. And so I thought I'd offer some perspectives on the role of the museum in terms of regeneration regarding art and science, and then also as a historian reflect on my work in terms both of the imperial city, but I think more germanely this morning about the Victorian city and the story of Victorian urban growth and then sort of pathways towards regeneration. The Victoria and Albert Museum, which was originally called the South Kensington Museum, was born of exactly this marriage of art and science in the service of urban renewal and urban regeneration. We emerged from that great fusion of art and science, which was the Great Exhibition of 1851 of all industry and manufacturing of all nations, which was this celebration not only of British commercial and industrial might, but also kind of woke Britain up to the growing competition from France, Germany, and America. And it was part of that sort of incredible range of mid-19th century exhibitions, which were in Dublin, which were in London, which were in Paris, within which the sort of nations vied in terms of their economic competition. Out of this emerges Albertopolis, Prince Albert's great vision going south from Kensington Palace towards Brompton, but they all thought the word Brompton sounded rather unfashionable, so they renamed it South Kensington. And that was the landscape within which the South Kensington Museum, what would later be the Natural History Museum, later the Science Museum, later Imperial College, Royal Albert Hall. This was the arts and science campus within which London would have the kind of competitive edge it needed to succeed against France, Germany, America in the future. The role of the South Kensington Museum was as the central storehouse or treasury of science and art for the use of the whole kingdom. In the rather dry words of an early annual report, the action of the department, and the V&A first began as something called the Department of Practical Art, being chiefly to stimulate and encourage the efforts made by localities for obtaining instruction in science and art. Its operations are directed to the creation of such means as will sustain active local cooperation in the promotion of the general objects entrusted to it. And behind all that, I think, was a very important vision of the role of London and its connections with English regions and localities. And as we think about art and science regeneration, the role of London as an incubator and motivator for those parts of the country which are not succeeding so well was right there at the beginning of the institution. So what the V&A would do would provide a reproduction of works of art for schools, extend elementary and higher instruction in practical art, train teachers for provincial cities, and make as publicly useful as possible the central schools, museums, and libraries of the department. So this was a kind of knowledge bank and a knowledge base for the cities and localities of Britain. The V&A splits from the Science Museum in 1899 and becomes the Victoria and Albert Museum at that point. And really that's that kind of two cultures moment that we see in the 20th century. Prior to that, the notion of science and art being these completely disparate pursuits was regarded as slightly alien. And I'm totally convinced that the move towards a digital society and a digital economy means that that kind of two cultures thinking is completely sort of mashed away. This is not an argument for taking over the Science Museum, but it is a suggestion that some of that 20th century thinking about the differential between science and art embedded in the institutions is slightly old-fashioned. More than that, we were heavily involved in the development of regional museums and civic regeneration right across the UK during the course of the mid-Victorian period. Because allied to this was a keen sense of what the city was for. And we saw some earlier pictures, but by the mid-19th century, some of the horrors of the Industrial Revolution had begun to ebb away, mainly as a result of massive investment. The kind of nadir of the Industrial Revolution is reached in the early 1830s, when the life expectancy of a city dweller in Liverpool or Glasgow, in some parts of Liverpool or Glasgow, was down to 24 years. And that was the lowest life expectancy since the Black Death. So the impact of the Industrial Revolution was sort of totalizing. And then yet, over a 30 to 40 year period, you begin to have the regeneration of cities, such as Liverpool. And with that, a new sense of the virtue and worth and nobility of the city, and particularly the mid-Victorian city, rather than just being these places of incredible immiseration, poverty, inequality. They actually become these rather noble places involved in noble enterprises. It was Disraeli, inevitably, who summed it up so brilliantly when he sought to describe the enormity of Manchester. And Manchester was the shock city of the Industrial Revolution. Manchester was the sort of Tokyo or Los Angeles of the 1980s. It was the kind of Berlin of the 1930s. It was the place you went to see the future. And in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, everyone from the world wanted to go to see Manchester. It's where Friedrich Engels would go to see the future of capitalism. It would be where Otto von Bismarck would go to see the future of social relations. It would be where Nathaniel Hawthorne would go. It was the city to go to. And Disraeli describes in Coningsby, his great work, he writes of how a great city whose image dwells in the memory of man is the type of some great idea. Rome represents conquest, faith hovers over the towers of Jerusalem, and Athens embodies the preeminent quality of the antique world, art. But, Disraeli said, the world was changing and a new civilization upon us. What art was to the ancient world, science is to the modern, the distinctive faculty. In the minds of men, the useful has succeeded to the beautiful. Instead of the city of the violet crown, a Lancashire village has expanded into a mighty region of factories and warehouses. Yet rightly understood, Manchester is as great a human exploit as Athens. And so the cities of the Industrial Revolution, Manchester, Liverpool, were embodying this great idea of progress and modernity. And yet, what is so very interesting about them, they sought to cloak that in historicism. So actually, for all Disraeli's talking about Manchester and Athens, actually it was Florence which Manchester looked to. And so the Italianate Florentine architecture, which is there in Manchester, was all about the cotton lords of the Medicis and that marriage of cotton and commerce, whereas Liverpool always more consciously looked to Athens and the classical tradition, maybe partly because of its slave trading past. But the subject of innovation and creativity in the history of cities is a theme beloved of historians. Peter Hall wrote a beautiful book called Great Cities in Their Golden Ages, which touched on the role of cosmopolitan cities as the sites that have, quotes, throughout history been the places that ignited the sacred flame of the human intelligence and the human imagination. And he goes on to chart Manchester in the 18th century, Florence in the 15th century, London in the 20th century. For the British, through history, I think there's also a particularity, because certainly in the last 200 years, Britain has been instrumental in developing global cities. After sporting pastimes and the English language, the wonderful travel writer and historian Jan Morris has described urbanism as the most lasting of the British imperial legacies. And she's right, and this was the subject of my book on 10 cities that made an empire, because from the Palladian glories of Leinster House in Dublin, and Dublin doesn't always regard itself as an imperial city, to the Ruskiniana fantasia of the old Victoria Terminus Mumbai, to Melbourne's Government House, to the harbour of Hong Kong, the footprint of the British Empire still remains willfully in evidence in terms of the urban world. And what is more, very interestingly, in terms of our memories of empire and the meaning of empire, it's now being preserved and restored at a remarkable rate. And actually, in many of these cities, there's a much less complicated relationship with some of these, as it were, concrete legacies of empire. Whether it's Hong Kong or Mumbai or indeed Shanghai or Dubai, what is interesting is how Britain's imperial cities currently play a far more significant role in the world affairs than many other European powers. At the peak of British imperial dominion in the late 19th and early 20th century, the economic and cultural driver of empire was a chain of major colonial cities, Bombay, Singapore, Melbourne. And today, I think what is interesting is that the world is witnessing a similar revival of the global city-state. Today, we talk about global cities and megacities, the work of Saskia Sassen on the global city as the key economic driver of the current era. Many of those not only have legacies within the British imperial past, but also the kind of economic system, the economic networks that they seek to generate seem to have an echo of our colonial heritage. The advice from branding agencies and management consultants today is for companies to think of future markets in terms of cities now, rather than countries. But quite rightly, few of us are interested in reviving the British Empire. So in the absence of that, let me just dwell on a few areas for discussion when it comes to art and science and the regeneration of our cities as a segue into our conversation. When I look at the history of the Victorian city, what was driving so much of it was the importance of liberty and the importance of freedom. And the Victorians very consciously looked to that idea of that idea that was there in the Hanseatic League and others in the medieval continental city-states of what would become Germany. That's Stadtluft macht frei, that city air makes you free. And the importance of cities was freedom. And at the core of that, particularly for Britain in the mid-19th century, was religious liberty. It was in the city that the kind of power of the Church of England, that the Anglican control was absent. It was in the city that you have this incredible fluorescence of non-conformist denominations, the Congregationalists, the Unitarians, the Baptists, the Methodists, and more often than not, they were at the forefront of urban renewal and civic leadership. And they celebrated this heritage. Those of you who know Manchester will know the Ford Mannix Brown frescoes inside Manchester Town Hall, and one of those about the defence, Bradshaw's defence of Manchester, is about religious liberty and religious freedom. So from the beginning, part of the energy and power of the city was this notion of freedom of conscience and liberty. With that, secondly, came political liberty and this great Victorian passion of the right of self-government. And so the growth of local government in the 19th century is very powerfully opposed to a kind of French idea of statism, that what you have, I mean, the kind of the irony given what happens to the 20th century sort of centralized state, but somehow in the mid-19th century there was this notion that it was a kind of Saxon birthright of the British to have self-government and local self-government to look after their own affairs. And with that came civil liberty and civil association, civil society. And one of the ironies of the Victorian city is that this city, which was always condemned for its kind of philistinism and sort of grad grind and hard times and isolation and loneliness, saw the most incredible fluorescence of civil society and civil association. There was a landscape of literary and philosophical societies, of clubs, lyceums, athenaeums, scientific institutes. The Liverpool city booster, Sir James Picton, had no doubt about the virtues of urban life. He wrote in the 1840s, "Policy, polity, politeness, urbanity, civility derive their names as well as their nature from city life, while the terms rustic, savage, heathen, pagan, indicate the rougher and more backward tendencies of the herdsmen and cultivators of the ground. So in contrast to that kind of aristocratic notion of rural virtue, in the mid-19th century, the city was the place of progress and civility, and that was reflected in civil association. And during the course of the 19th century, that will become as much a working class story as a middle class story, pursued more often than not through leisure. And today, I think the importance of liberty and a notion of freedom is more vital than ever, particularly for cities. According to the OECD, a more decentralized approach to government correlates with stronger growth, more social investment, better educational outcomes, higher well-being, and less regional inequality. And more than that, devolved politics produces growth which is much more inclusive, with a significantly larger proportion of money staying within the community. As the American political scientist Benjamin Barber has recently argued in his brilliant work, If Mayors Ruled the World, Dysfunctional Nations, Rising Cities, pragmatic metropolitan leaders are proving much more effective, popular, and innovative as political leaders all around the world. And I think we've seen a really substantial shift to this in British politics in the last 5-7 years, but it has to make sure it continues, because we still remain too centralised. For every £1 which is taxed locally in the UK, only 9p comes back from the Treasury. So you still have this incredible centralisation. Only 5% of taxpayers' money is retained by local government. In Sweden, it's more than a third. In France, around a half. Whilst in Canada, it's a staggering 80%. If you have a tax base which retains its taxation, your ability then to make decisions that affect communities in a more sustainable and equitable way is pretty obvious. Part of the success of the Victorian story of cultural creativity and innovation was the ability to tax locally, to establish museums, art galleries, and public parks. And I think one of the things, particularly when and colleagues will know this better than me, but particularly when it comes to museums, is that, and I reflect on this in terms of my previous life in Stoke-on-Trent, we've got a lot of museums which want to become trusts, mainly because of financial necessity, and they come together. But you also have local authorities which refuse to let them go. So you have, on the one hand, them depriving them of the necessary funds because they're facing incredible budget cuts, but then they want to be in charge of the publicity, the programme, the leadership. So it's the worst of all worlds for these museums. On the one hand, they don't have the autonomy and the capacity they need, but neither do they have the funding support. And I think we should be quite tough with local authorities, which is, if you're going to have these as part of the local authority, fine, well, they need to be supported, but if not, then they need the freedom to innovate. Secondly, after liberty, sustaining wealth creation. Again, when I look back at my time in Stoke-on-Trent was a place of incredible skills. In fact, some of the most incredible skills in the world in terms of ceramic production. But when it came to formal education, it was far down the league table. And when we look at cities with powerful single industry past, be it Liverpool, Hull, or Stoke-on-Trent, it is clear that what holds them back in the 21st century is a lack of educational achievement. When you could leave school at 16 and work your entire life without going to school, and work it successfully and move from job to job, that culture then of formal education, the need for formal education, is often not embedded in the communities in the manner in which it needs. The old jobs, the docks, fishing, pottery, didn't require the formal education, and so a culture of learning failed to take root in many communities. But we know that in an urban economy, skills are the most important factor determining long-run urban success. And the work of the Harvard economist Edward Glaeser is brilliant on this. Why did Detroit fall and Boston succeed, when actually Boston was more over-dependent on certain industries than Detroit was on the car industry? Because of the skills base and the nimbleness of an urban economy, which had the capacity to move in the face of economic change. It is skills which provide the ability to overcome the exigencies of global economic change. Again, successful cities have had strong histories of public education stretching across technical and academic. Universities, colleges, and museums are the engines of long-term economic growth and productivity. So today, I think, when it comes to this area of thinking, I would give our newly devolved mayors of our cities much greater control over education policy, provisioning of schools, the management of schools. I think the Mayor of London, the Mayor of Manchester, North East, why are they still beholden to the Department for Education about which schools should go where and which should be provided? I'd like to see a revival of Polytechnics. I think that having, as the country moves towards advanced levels, apprenticeships, and that trajectory, a really successful polytechnic model based serving a local economy would be very, very powerful. Our universities are very sniffy still about getting involved in schools and education. We don't have the skills, we're not interested. It's all very difficult. It's not that difficult, actually. They need to show some leadership on that and get involved. When you look at the state of some schools around Oxford and Cambridge or some other Russell Group universities, and they sort of throw their hands up in horror saying, we can't do anything about it. I think they probably could do something about it. And a technical education component. We're kind of getting there, I think, finally, I'd get rid of GCSEs. Cancel GCSEs. What we need is a 14 to 19 technical and academic education trajectory, particularly in cities that need the regeneration we want. Thirdly, identity. One of the most important elements to understand about, I think, the power of the idea of the city in the 19th century was this incredible close alliance between a sense of identity, particularly initially of the urban middle classes, and the notion of the city, that their identity as a kind of bourgeoisie was embedded within the urban environment and the nature of the city. And they themselves had a sense of lineage going back to the kind of great cities of the European past. And so what they wanted to do in cities like Liverpool was sort of place themselves within that lineage and celebrate their identity as an urban bourgeoisie within the architecture and the environment. And that's why you have such passionate debates about the nature of architecture in the mid-Victorian city. The battle of the styles, almost a sort of savage public inquiry about which style Northampton Town Hall should be built in, whether it should be Venetian Gothic or whether it should be Christian Gothic, and what this meant about the identity of Northampton and the identity of the people of Britain. But then what you see in the late 19th century is the beginning of the dissipation of that really close alliance between middle classes and provincial cities. In his 1957 essay, A.J.P. Taylor described how Manchester, which had once been the symbol of a civilization and ambition of mankind, was, by the early 20th century, little more than a historical curiosity. Mournfully, he noted, the merchant princes have departed. They are playing at country life in Cheshire or trying to forget Manchester in Bournemouth and Torquay. There are no more dinner parties, no more bustle of social occasions. J.B. Priestley remarked how in the modern West Ridings, the wealthier industrialists are busy turning themselves into country gentlemen. Now they are gone and their places have not been taken by other families. Having a strong sense of sort of patriotism and identity embedded in the city is very, very powerful driver of renewal and change. And I think for modern cities, it's all about capturing the late 20 and early 30-year-olds after graduation, how you embed them within the city, and all of the work that this seminar is about culture and education and open spaces and all of those intangible elements which provide kind of a decent, exciting Liverpool environment, actually captures the skills and the human capital, connects individuals to the urban environment, which is incredibly important for long-term economic success. Finally, the importance of leadership. There's no doubt that where you have stable political leadership the results are phenomenal. And so whether it was the kind of grouping around Joseph Chamberlain in the 1870s, whether it was Herbert Morrison in London in the 1930s, or whether it's been Richard Leese and Howard Bernstein in the last 20 years in Manchester, the ability to take long-term decisions for the city and have political control is very powerful. My former colleague Mike Caine, the Manchester MP, always liked to make the joke about how when the state visit of President Xi Jinping to Manchester, and there was a meeting between a one-party authoritarian leader and the leader of China. But the degree of stability and leadership provided by Leeds, and that, in a sense, is the story of the difference in many ways between Manchester and Liverpool. I think Liverpool now has its act together to a great degree, but the political instability of Liverpool for 20 years was a real sort of drag on success. So what is the role of cultural institutions within this? Well, drawing some of it together, I think the building, as you know, and colleagues will know far better than me, building that sense of place and identity, providing the glue and feel for a community. And I think we all know it goes beyond the kind of Bilbao effect. It's engendering and embedding the intangibles. And I was very, very struck by the Hepworth, Wakefield, and the attempts at regeneration in Wakefield going on around that incredible gallery recently. We know that it's not just the kind of iconic architecture, it's everything that is built around that, and I'll say more about what we're doing at the V&A in a minute. Secondly, providing the skills and capacity. Museums as places of the future, not the past. These are incubators of skills and talent and innovation. And we have to make the very strong case that the kind of jobs that we create and promote in the future are going to be less susceptible to the impact of automation and robots. Actually, your kind of future-proofing skills in the creative economy and the creative industry. We know that cultural investment can be motors for further investment and regeneration, and we also know that museums play an incredible role and cultural institutions play a very important role in terms of engagement, cross-community partnership, spaces for civic collaboration and partnership. So what the V&A is doing is very much in line with that. We were, in contrast to these fine surroundings, we were never a fine art museum. The V&A always had these slightly kind of grubby realities, and we engaged with the world as we found it. And so what we're focusing on now is going back to our roots in the 1840s and 50s in the design schools and the Mechanics Institute. We're very concerned about the collapse of art and design and technology, particularly in disadvantaged areas in the state education system. So beginning this September, initially in Coventry and Blackburn, we're going to be working with local museums and coalitions of secondary schools to help to try to teach the new design and technology GCSE. We're bringing all the exam boards together in July at the V&A. We're then going to see how we use our curators and our artifacts to make this new design and technology curriculum a success, and then hopefully roll that out further if we can manage it. We're involved in regeneration, particularly in Dundee. V&A Dundee will open next summer, and the effect it's had in the terms of construction of a new park, new hotel, new railway provision, it is a remarkable accelerator for growth in that great city. We are the largest lender of artifacts to other museums in the country. So again, going back to our origins, we see our role, yes, in South Kensington, but in Stoke-on-Trent, in Coventry, in Newcastle. We provide, as the kind of national museum, as much facility as possible, as much artifacts as possible to other museums around the country. And what we're also doing is focusing and I think this is an area which has collapsed in the last 10 years. It was never great, but now it's terrible, on careers guidance. If you want to get into the creative industries, if you want to build that future, your pathway to getting there is very complicated, particularly if you haven't got the networks and the connections, particularly if your teachers don't understand some of those routes. So again, as a national museum, we provide careers education for thinking about how to get into those areas, and that seems to me the kind of role a national museum should be doing. But we all have to fight for these investments and support. In 1888, just so you know, our struggle continues. One civic commentator was already commentating that The only adjuncts to a municipality which are looked upon as absolutely indispensable beyond street improvements, drainage, lighting and waterworks are a jail and a workhouse, with their concomitants of police, magistrates and a share in a lunatic asylum and the national hangman. We are most lavish in our expenditure under these heads, but when we come to the expenditure for education, we resort to rigid retrenchment. A new torpedo is considered greater value than 100 museums. The V&A has been central to the art and science of regeneration for 170 years, and I hope in the next few years we'll continue to do so. Thank you.